Thursday, the Lib Dems announced their own alternative budget, with Danny Alexander flourishing a budget briefcase, in bright yellow, naturally, and taking to the dispatch box to outline his economic plans.
To all those people left cold by yesterday's exchanges, to all those asking themselves, is there another way? Today I say, yes, there is. Yes. There is a better way. Today I set out a better economic plan for Britain, a plan that is based on values of fairness as well as strength, Mr. Speaker.
Labour's Chris Leslie had the job of responding. And just listen to Labour MP's reaction as Nick Clegg sneaks out of the chamber early.
What recourse do we have as the official opposition when statements are being made which are not government policy? And I don't know where the Deputy Prime Minister's going. I think that is his valedictory appearance in the House of Commons.
The fact that the coalition would last right until the start of the short campaign is something few foresaw in 2010. I was joined by the Lib Dem commentator Mark Pack, editor of the Liberal Democrat Newswire, to talk about the party's remarkable journey and perhaps the troubles ahead. I began by asking, was it fair to say the separate Lib Dem budget had been a bad idea?
No. You'll be surprised to know that's my view, but I think it's not a fair assessment because the very fact that we're talking about it and the very fact that in the advance of the budget, there was the news there would be an alternative Liberal Democrat budget. On the day of the budget, there was the news there would be an alternative Liberal Democrat budget. And then on the day of the alternative Liberal Democrat budget, there was news that that was happening. Gave the Liberal Democrats 3 extra bites at the cherry of making this point that George Osborne is committed to some quite mammoth and painful spending cuts and believing in huge extra cuts in welfare and not taxing the richest any extra. And that's a very different approach from the one the Liberal Democrats have of thinking there should be a much more equal balance between tax rises and spending cuts to finish off clearing the deficit. So having the alternative budget complete with the slightly twee yellow budget box and all of that, I think actually worked quite well at getting that message over. One slightly odd thing on the yellow budget box is it was actually auctioned off at Liberal Democrat conference a few days earlier by Danny Alexander as a fundraising move. So I'm not quite sure how we managed to get it back again.
Maybe onto him, sort of eBay bad feedback of him for him not delivering it to whoever bought it. Lib Dems do seem quite chipper always. They always seem quite on message, very disciplined. How has that been achieved?
I think there are 2 reasons. One is a very sort of insider Westminster thing, but fundamentally Liberal Democrat MPs actually get on with each other quite well. The other reason is just quite simply the polling in Liberal Democrat parliamentary constituencies is much, much better than overall polling across the country as a whole.
And Nick Clegg has been a strong leader of the Liberal Democrats. I think he's maintained the loyalty of the party through some very difficult times. But if the worst does happen for him and he either loses his seat or he gets pushed out in coalition negotiations, who are the likely replacements?
Well, the bookies' favourite, and quite rightly so, is Tim Farron, Liberal Democrat MP up in the northwest. Hugely impressive electoral track record in his seat at both local and parliamentary elections, even at European elections, a sort of election Liberal Democrats don't exactly specialise in, and a massively gifted natural orator, very, very skilled at public speaking and so on. And because he is the front runner in a way, the next question is who is the most plausible non-Tim Farron candidate. There are quite a few who would like to see themselves in that role, but I think the most likely is Norman Lamb, MP in Norfolk. Been a health minister, he's had a very good track record of sort of winning over the supporter party members and activists on some quite controversial issues. The record he has on mental health is also, quite an impressive one. He's one of the Liberal Democrat MPs who can point to their time as a minister and really say, I made a difference. And
Tim Farron's generally regarded as being on the left of the party in contrast to the kind of orange bookers, the sort of David Law's wing of the party. Where does Norman Lamb sit on that spectrum?
I think in the conventional wisdom, Norman Lamb you would put as being an orange booker, although it is notable that he has been a prime mover in pushing very hard for the party to back spending more money on the NHS, and particularly on mental health, but more on the NHS in general. So he's not a right-wing cut public spending person in that respect. And therefore, although there may be a little bit of orange book versus non-orange book of underlying tension in a leadership contest, I think that would not be the fundamental dividing line. And perhaps that's best illustrated by Vince Cable, who is, I think, probably too old to be a plausible leadership candidate this time round, but obviously who he decides to back may be very influential with party members. He contributed to the orange book. Yet he's also, in terms of his comments about economic and related issues, often sounds more like he's on the left wing of the party. So you can't really neatly categorise Vince as sort of one or the other.
And I think he once burned Ed Miliband spectacularly by saying, "I've been a member of the Labour Party longer than you have."
Absolutely, a former Labour Party member. I mean, his views on the banking system are, well to the left of, frankly, much of the Labour front bench. But on the other hand, you look at his contribution towards the Orange Book, he's not by any means a sort of out-and-out left-winger. He's a much more nuanced view. And a lot of Liberal Democrats have that mix of, on some issues, you might think they're left of where Labour is. On other issues, you might think, in a way, the answer is because Liberal Democrats are liberal rather than simply fitting in a neat left-right category.
And finally, to be very unfair, if you had to predict how many seats the Liberal Democrats will hold and who the next leader after Nick Clegg would be, if you were a betting man, who would you and how many would you go for?
I wouldn't bet on the number of seats because I think that is such an open prospect. In terms of betting, I would bet on Norman Lamb. I think probably Tim Farron is more likely to be the leader, but if you look at the odds available on Norman Lamb, when I last looked, they were still around 7 or 8 to 1, and actually Norman's chances are much, much better than that, so that's where the value bet lies.
That was Mark Pack on the future of the Lib Dems. But one Lib Dem who won't be part of that future, at least in the House of Commons, is Sir Ming Campbell, who is standing down in May. He was the party's leader from March 2006 to October 2007, and unlike, say, Tony Blair, he chose to stay in Parliament after handing the leadership on to his successor. It's a choice that David Cameron recently told BuzzFeed he would also make.
It's the country's choice. If they hoof me out and go for the other guy, I'll have to think of something else, but I hope I'll still be a member of Parliament. In the unhappy event I'm not Prime Minister on May the 8th, the people of West Oxfordshire, I hope, will stick with me and I'll stick with them.
So what benefit is there to staying in Parliament once your time in the spotlight is over? I asked Sir Ming what motivated his decision.
Before I could think twice, my constituency association had got on to me and said, look, whatever you do, please don't stand down. And so, because these were the people who'd supported me through thick and thin, I felt I had to accept that, if you like, obligation and understanding. I think there is a real issue for those who've been leaders and who stepped down. And of course, as you know, Gordon Brown has found some controversy about that because he has remained a member of Parliament, but for various reasons, because of his other interests, a lot of them on behalf of the United Nations, he hasn't been a regular attender. I think if you've been Prime Minister, for example, like Tony Blair for so many years, when he stood down, I think the obvious thing for him was to go, because nothing would ever quite be the same again.
Are you telling me there's not such glamour in being a Lib Dem leader then?
There's not such glamour in being any leader, actually. I mean, I think people don't understand the extent to which the strains of leadership have got worse and worse and worse.
And was it hard to go back to being a regular MP?
Not really, because I'd only been leader for 18 months. So I hadn't forgotten how to be a backbencher. And my particular interests have always been foreign affairs and defence. And I was absolutely determined that I was going to pick up these interests again. And where better, where easier to do that than in the House of Commons. I very quickly became a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee and also the Intelligence and Security Committee. And I've kept these two interests through the whole of the last Parliament for the 5 years, since 2010.
So is that the benefit then of having a few former leaders still around, is that they've been through that experience, they can help their successors and they can also help out in select committees and pursue their other interests? Yeah,
and I suppose it brings a bit of stability. I think when it comes to dealing with your successor, though, you have to be enormously careful. Jim Callaghan served in the Royal Navy during the war, and so a lot of his aphorisms were based on his naval experience. And he said about being a former leader, don't interfere with the man at the wheel and don't spit on the deck. There's something not formally created, but there's a kind of ex-leaders club, the membership of which requires you not to cause trouble for your successor.
And could you see David Cameron doing the same, staying on in the Commons?
I think it's highly unlikely. I think if you've been Prime Minister for some time, as he has, then the notion that you might stay around, a bit like a ghost at the feast, I think that's quite difficult, because a former Prime Minister can't go on to select committees or, in my case, become the leader of the British delegation to something called the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Simply not practical, and it would be, I suppose, undermining to some extent the previous achievement. No, I shall be very surprised indeed, were David Cameron to be defeated, if he did not wait for a respectable 5 or 6 months and then step down and go off and do other things.